Good morning. Welcome to Teshuvah, the art of return and change. The power and process of Teshuvah. Teshuvah is something that applies all year round, every day, every night, every hour, every moment. It's a perpetual action, but it is especially relevant in the month of Elul, the month of introspection, the month of stock taking, the month of paying up our debts, as we discussed last week, in preparation for the new year. This is an especially important time for Teshuvah. And the underlying issue here is change. Could we change? Because if we believe that we cannot change, then the question is, what is the whole purpose of Teshuvah? I didn't translate the word Teshuvah deliberately, because we'll get to it a little bit later, what the exact translation is. But somehow everyone recognizes, if they ever heard the word Teshuvah, that it's connected to the idea of change. So, should we really focus our attention on changing if we believe that it's futile, that a human being is programmed, a human being cannot change? There are worse schools of theology, of psychology and physics that believe very strongly that we cannot change. We are programmed beings, each from a different perspective. From theology, it's one perspective; from psychology, another; from physics, a third. So it's obvious that Judaism, with its emphasis on the idea of Teshuvah, believes that yes, you can change. And it's based on a fundamental difference between the way we view ourselves as human beings and the way evolutionists do. Evolutionists believe that we are animals, and it seems that animals are programmed beings. Animals don't have free choice. At least that's what most people believe, that animals don't have free choice, and that's what Judaism believes, that animals do not have free choice. But if a human being is no better and no more important in the scheme of creation than an animal, we're just advanced animals, and there are people who believe that we're inferior to animals, that we're messing up the world for the animals and other creatures. But we believe that the human being is a distinct creation, that God created a humanity that is distinct from the way He created everything else. A human being is endowed with a soul. A human being is created in God's image. What does that mean, in God's image? God doesn't have an image. So the commentators explain that it means that just like God has free choice, obviously, God could choose whatever He wants. He's not programmed. By definition, God is beyond any programming, any limits, any finite descriptions, any characterizations. And therefore, God has the ability to choose whatever He wants. God endowed us, humanity, with that same gift of free choice when it comes to doing good or comes to doing evil. So we believe that a human being is, yes, a human being also has an animal part, an animal component. A human being also has a vegetative component and an inanimate component. Humanity, or life, is divided into these four categories: inanimate, vegetative, animal, and human. And the human being is a unique creation that it encompasses all the other three, but in addition to the other three, it also has this distinct divine character that gives us the ability to transform every other aspect of our being. In other words, yes, we have an animal within us, but because the animal is part of our whole entity of human identity, the human identity has the effect that it could change the animal within us and tame the animal and transform the animal. That's a basic belief for Jews, that the human being is in total control of his entire being. And yes, we can change. You know, this guy, Abe Goldberg, is walking down the street and he bumps into someone and he says, "Oh, I didn't recognize you, Mr. Shapiro, Josh Shapiro." And the guy says, and he looks at him and he says, "You used to be so tall and now you're so short. You used to be so fat and now you're so skinny. You used to have black hair and now you have blonde hair." The guy says, "I'm not Josh Shapiro." He said, "Oh, and you changed your name as well." So there were disciplines that believed that humans cannot change, but modern psychology and neurology believes that the brain can expand, can change, the plasticity of the brain. They used to know that that's true about a child. The child is developing and forming his whatever goes on in the brain is being formed in the early stages of a person's life. But now they believe, neurologists believe, that it can happen at any stage in a person's life. People can change. How many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is, it has to want to change. No number of psychologists will do it if it doesn't want to change. How many rabbis will it take to change a light bulb? All the rabbis in the world won't be enough because they'll never agree how to do it. How many Kabbalists does it take to change a light bulb? You don't need the light bulb. You have your inner light. You have the Zohar, which comes from the word that means radiance, splendor, light. So you don't need the light bulb at all. So they're not going to talk about changing the light bulb. In order to change, you need three things. You have to have the right psychological profile. In other words, you have to want to change. You have to believe that you could change, first and foremost. If you don't believe you can change, if you believe that the way you are is the way you have to remain, then of course you're not going to change. But then you have to know how to change. Within the context of Judaism, that's what you need the rabbi for. But ultimately, the way to change is by getting in touch with the inner light of your soul. That's really how people can truly change. And that is what Teshuvah is all about. The art and science of changing is what we refer to as Teshuvah, which exists on many levels. There's Teshuvah in terms of changing our behavior. You could be the same rotten person in terms of your personality, but you behave the right way. You don't act out your negative character. Some people who do act out the negative character have to change their behavior. That's one form of a level of Teshuvah where you change behavior, but nothing else changes, just behavior. And then there's Teshuvah where you change your thought process, the way you think. Someone convinces you that you're looking at life, you're looking at yourself, you're looking at others with a wrong view. You have to change your worldview, your mindset. And then there's changing your whole personality. Obviously, the latter, the personality change, is the most difficult and most challenging of all. But Judaism believes that it's possible to do that on all three levels: to change behavior, to change your mindset, your outlook, and to change even your personality. Which is the most important of these three? If you have a choice, you can change one or the other. Which one would you choose? Yes. Whatever you said, you're right. Clearly, what's most important is your behavior. I don't care if someone harbors a desire to murder, but he controls his desire and he controls his behavior. I would prefer that much more than a person who changes his personality but still goes ahead and kills someone. behavior is the most important thing to change. But if you only change your behavior and nothing else changes, the likelihood is that the behavior is not going to last for too long. You want to change the person's inner self in order for the person to change in behavior. So yes, behavior change is the most important thing. We're living in a world of action, and action is what counts. But you want to make sure that that action is not just a temporary thing, a temporary change, that is going to be permanent. You have to work on changing your mindset, and you have to work on changing your personality. But if you can't do that, a person should not say, you know what? I can't change my personality. This is how I am. This is what people always say. This is you have to accept me the way I am. Yes, I'll accept you the way you are, but provided you behave properly, provided that you don't act differently. That you don't act in a way that is inconsistent. A way that is inconsistent with what's decent and proper. You know, they tell this story, I think I told this joke not too long ago, but no one will ever attack you for repeating a joke. This guy comes to the bar, orders a beer, and takes the beer, full glass of beer, and throws it at the bartender. And the bartender says, what was that all about? And he says, oh, I just can't control myself. I have this crazy thing. I won't do it again. Comes in the next week, orders a beer, and he does the same thing. He throws it at the bartender. And again he says, oh, I knew I shouldn't have done this, but I couldn't control myself. When this repeats itself a third time, the bartender says, look, you better get some counseling. Because if you don't get counseling, I don't want you back in this bar. Do you understand? Yes, I'll go to the best psychologist. A year later, he shows up, orders a beer, and takes the beer and throws it at the bartender. And the bartender says, I thought you were supposed to go for counseling. He says, yeah, I did. I went to the counselor every week. So what happened? He says, I don't feel guilty anymore. But he still throws the beer. So if you don't feel guilty anymore, if you change your behavior, your personality, you change your mindset, that's not good enough. You have to change behavior. That's the most important thing in life. But in order for that change of behavior to be genuine, to be something that will endure, you have to work on changing your personality as well, and certainly your way of thinking. What does the word Teshuvah mean? It's usually translated as repentance. What does that imply? When you say the word repentance,
you're sorry for what you've done.
You're sorry for what you did, yeah. But actually, that's not what the word means. The word Teshuvah comes from a root that means return. You're returning. Where are you returning? What does it mean you're returning? To whom are you returning? Where are you returning? Let's say you're a person who behaved badly all his or her life, and you want to do Teshuvah. You're not returning because this is the way you always were. So what does it mean that you're returning? So the simple meaning of that is that there's a certain standard that is considered right, considered righteous and proper, and you deviated from that standard and you're returning to that standard. But in Hasidic literature, it gives a much deeper explanation of the meaning of Teshuvah. Just going to mute them over here. The basic belief is that internally, inherently, we are all good because we have the spark of divinity in us. We have a soul that is pure and righteous and godly. And when we behave in ways that are contradictory to that inner self, that's called deviating. That's called we strayed from ourselves. And that your sin was not you. Your sin was the outer personality, but not your inner personality. Because deep down, you are really good. Now, we know that in different schools of thought, argue about this, whether we're inherently good. People who tend to be more liberal-minded generally feel that society is good, and it's external pressures that cause people to commit crimes. It's not the criminal, but it's society. More conservative viewpoints know that people are inherently bad and we have to use more force to control people because we're not essentially good. Judaism doesn't agree with either of these two positions. Judaism believes that humanity has different layers of being. The underlying layer of humanity is not good. But if you dig deeper, you'll find the pure essence of what it is to be human, and in particular what it is to be a Jew. In other words, as the Rabbi once responded to someone who referred to Freud and Freud's belief that everything that a person is motivated by sexuality and things like that, by base desires and so on. So the question was asked of the Rebbe if Judaism agrees or disagrees with that. And the Rebbe says, look, when you're digging in the ground and you dig, what will you find? You'll find a lot of dirt. But if you keep on digging, you'll find treasures. That a human being has many different layers, and the surface layer is affected mostly by what's beneath the surface, and beneath the surface is not positive. A child grows up, as it says in the Torah, as a wild animal. We start off with very selfish interests. What does a child want? The child wants everything for itself. It's very selfish, but that's normal for a child. It's when the childlike selfishness continues into adulthood, that's when we become very dangerous creatures, because that's the underlying motivation of a person to be self-centered. But if you dig deeper, you'll discover that there's a pure, pristine essence of the person's personality that is good, inherently good and divine and holy. So Teshuvah means the ability to dig deeper into your psyche, to dig deeper into your personality, to discover the treasures that lie beneath the surface, deep down beneath the surface. You have a question? Oh, I thought you were holding your beard. It sounded like a question.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
what about nature and nurture? If you're raised in a loving family, that would determine how the goodness can rise to the surface. But if you were abused or neglected as a child,
Right.
that will affect.
That's 100% true. That nurture has very much to do with your personality. It's not the only thing, but it's very much connected to that. That's why a person who has a good upbringing, raised in a good family, you could expect that person to be more in touch with their inner goodness. Whereas the person who had a terrible, abusive upbringing will be more likely to express the negative aspects of their personality. But everybody has the ability to dig deeper and to find the pure essence. Even the person who was abused, the person who had a terrible upbringing, is raised by evil parents in the worst possible environment, they still have the ability to dig deeper. It takes much more effort on their part. And they have to first believe in it as well, that they could change. The story I heard from my grandfather about the Baal Shem Tov, then I heard it told in the name of another great rabbi, but either way, it's the same story. That the Baal Shem Tov had a distant relative who was a doctor who became very secular. In those days, it was unusual for someone to break away from Judaism because most Jews were observant at that time, 250 years ago. And he moved far away from where the Baal Shem Tov lived. And one day, they were both invited to a wedding of a mutual relative, and they sat the doctor next to the Baal Shem Tov, hoping that the Baal Shem Tov will try to influence him, to inspire him to become a better Jew. And the Baal Shem Tov was silent, didn't say a word to him, maybe greeted him, and that was it. The whole meal went by, and the guy's nervous. The guy's psyching himself, when am I going to get this tongue lashing by this rabbi? And at the end of the meal, when everyone is ready to leave, the Baal Shem Tov turns to him and he says, I want to ask you a question. Okay, now it's coming. If you had to buy a horse, what horse would you buy? A healthy horse or a crippled horse? And he looks at the Baal Shem Tov. This is the great rabbi, the brilliant man who's known for his wisdom, and that's all he could think of asking me, which is a better horse, a healthy horse or a sick horse? And he says, well, obviously a healthy horse is better. So the Baal Shem Tov says, no, I disagree. Because what happens if you're traveling on the road and you have a healthy horse and you veer off course? Within a few minutes, you'll be miles away from the right path. If you have a crippled horse, then how far could it stray? It can't stray too far. So it goes a few feet away from the road, and it doesn't have to go very, very far to come back. And the doctor says, no, you're wrong, because if you're a healthy horse, even if you stray very far, you could come back as quickly as you had strayed. And the Baal Shem Tov says, yes, a healthy horse can come back very quickly. That's you. So if you're a healthy horse, then it's easier to come back. Some people have more of that energy in them, and if you're not a healthy horse, it'll take a little bit longer. But everyone has the power to come back. In the Kabbalistic terminology, we know that God's name consists of 4 letters. This is the essential name of God: a Yud, a Hey, a Vav, and a Hey. And in Kabbalah, in Jewish mysticism and Hasidic literature, we're taught that when God invests His soul, His energy into our soul, it's the last letter Hey that animates us. That's the power of animation of the human being. When a person does a sin, you're dragging that letter Hey, that part of the divine, into the quagmire, into the mud, into the dirt. You're schlepping, you're dragging God's energy, represented by that letter Hey, into your evil behavior. So not only are you doing something wrong, and it's damaging you, in effect it's also damaging God, as it were. God is allowing Himself, He created us that way, that we could drag His presence into the dirt. So when a person does Teshuvah, what is he essentially accomplishing? He's restoring the Hey back to God's name, because the Hey has been detached. That Hey, that energy has been detached from the other 3 letters of His name. So that's why Teshuvah, if you take the word Teshuvah, you can break it into 2 words. Tashuv, Hey. You're returning the Hey, the letter Hey, to its rightful place. So what you're doing with Teshuvah is not only restoring your own decency to where it belongs, but you're restoring the divine in you that you've sullied by virtue of your sin. Now, do we have to do Teshuvah? Let's say I sinned the other day. I'm not going to confess here. But I sinned the other day, and I'm just too lazy to do Teshuvah. Maybe Yom Kippur comes around, maybe I'll do Teshuvah then, because it's in style then. But today, I'm not going to sin today, but I'm not going to do Teshuvah. Could I just sit back and not do Teshuvah? So there's a commentary, a 19th century commentary, one of the great classic writers of Jewish law, who claims that Maimonides did not consider it to be an obligation to do Teshuvah. Because the way Maimonides phrases the laws of Teshuvah, Maimonides has a whole section called the laws of Teshuvah. He says when a person does Teshuvah, they should confess their sin. So he says that let me just finish the thought. That reads that it's like there's a mitzvah, one of the 613 commandments is divorce. There's no commandment that you have to divorce your wife. But the commandment is, if you decide to divorce your wife, you have to do it in a certain way. Likewise, you don't have to do teshuvah, you don't have to repent, but if you want to repent and get the benefits from it, then the way to do it is through confession. That's how this 19th century authority interprets the words of Maimonides. And likewise, Maimonides, and when he lists the different commandments in the Torah, he also lists confession as the mitzvah. He doesn't say that teshuvah is the mitzvah, it's the confession that's the mitzvah. So it seems to suggest that according to Maimonides, teshuvah is not an obligation. Yes?
I would say that is because the whole purpose of existence is that God viewed us with free will. If you make teshuvah an obligation, you're reducing the ability of the soul to choose what it wants. So when it comes to the point where it must return or teshuvah.
You have a good point there. I'll soon get to it. That's how the Rabbi understands that approach. However, the Rabbi negates that interpretation, and he says that if you really examine Maimonides' words more carefully, he doesn't say what he's purported to have said. Because the Rambam, in his introduction to the laws of teshuvah, says that the mitzvah of teshuvah is to return. So he makes it clear that that is the mitzvah of teshuvah, to return, that it is a commandment. But the reason why he lists the confession is because whenever there's a commandment that has two components, a mental component and a physical, a verbal component, the mitzvah that we count as one of the commandments is always the action one, the one that involves action. Same thing with prayer. Prayer is mostly a service of the heart. The basis of prayer doesn't say anywhere in the Torah you have to pray. It says you should serve God with all your heart. So the Talmud says, what's that mean? That means prayer. So prayer is a service of the heart. But if you only pray in your heart, you didn't fulfill the mitzvah properly. You have to verbalize the words of prayer. Same thing with teshuvah. Teshuvah is essentially in the heart. It's a change in the heart. But if you don't verbalize it, you didn't fulfill the mitzvah properly. Nevertheless, the Rebbe says the point that you just made, that the reason why there's such a concept that teshuvah is not a commandment is because it's deeper than a commandment. A commandment, we have free choice. That's a premise of Judaism, that every human being has free choice. We all have the choice to do right or wrong. We don't have the right to do wrong, but we have the ability to choose one way or the other. So when you are commanded to do something, what does that do to you? That impinges on your free choice. It takes a little bit away of the free choice. If someone who's taller than you and stronger than you is holding a big stick and says, I want you to do me a favor, what do you say? Sure. You still have free choice. You could say no, but there's a certain amount of pressure that person is exerting. By virtue of the fact that God commands us to do something, that makes the free choice a little bit less free. It's still free choice, but it's not as pronounced, as prominent, as it's something that you're doing completely out of your own volition, of the own goodness of your heart. That's why teshuvah, the ideal level of teshuvah, is to reach such a deep part of your soul that it's completely free. There's no imposition. There's no need to be commanded to do it. That's why there's such a concept that teshuvah may not be a commandment, because it really goes deeper than a commandment. It involves total free choice. So let's go. Yes.
So is a commandment is a mitzvah, but a mitzvah is not necessarily a commandment?
Well, the word mitzvah could be used many different ways. The literal translation of a mitzvah is a commandment. But sometimes the word mitzvah is used for anything that you do that is desirable. That's it. You did a mitzvah. Maybe I shouldn't repeat this joke. Maybe I'll repeat it again. This guy is worried before Yom Kippur. It's before Yom Kippur, so we can tell this joke. He says, I don't know what I'm going to do Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is a day of atonement. I don't have any sins. It's going to be a wasted Yom Kippur. I have to do some small sin, but what am I going to do? I don't have any temptation to do any sins. So his wife tells him, down the street there's a terrible guy who beats his wife. He's a horrible person. Give him a little beating, and that'll be your sin for before Yom Kippur. So he goes down the street, he goes to the person's house, he beats him up, and he leaves feeling good. I have one little sin at least before Yom Kippur. And then the wife of that wife beater sticks her head out the window and says, you don't know what a mitzvah you just did. Yes, so sometimes we use the word mitzvah loosely. Yes.
Which would it be considered higher to God? A commandment, or a commandment of mitzvah, or doing teshuvah, doing it voluntarily?
Teshuvah, by definition, transcends every other mitzvah because it can correct the damage caused by every mitzvah. When you do teshuvah, let's say a person is a thief. He does teshuvah, God forgives him. That means that teshuvah has the ability to erase the violation of any commandment. So teshuvah reaches a connection to God that's greater than the connection through any other mitzvah. Teshuvah is, in a certain sense, the greatest mitzvah of all. Now, let's do the anatomy of teshuvah. What exactly does a person have to do teshuvah? So the most basic requirement is a resolution for the future. For example, if you're a thief and he wants to repent, he has to resolve not to do it again. If there's no resolve, if the person says, you know what, I want to do teshuvah, but I can't control myself, I want to do it again. Maybe I'll do it another few times and then I'll stop. But I'm really sorry that I did it. That's not teshuvah. That the most fundamental aspect of teshuvah is resolve for the future, where the person says, I'm not sorry I did it necessarily in the past. I enjoyed myself. I got something out of it. The sin was pleasurable. But I won't do it again because I know it's wrong, so I won't do it again. But I'm not remorseful. I don't regret doing it. That would be a very low level teshuvah, but it's still effective.
It's actually the beginning of teshuvah. It's the beginning of recognition.
It is the beginning, yes, but that's the first. If the person, on the other hand, says, I'm sorry I did it, but I'll keep on doing it, that's much worse than a person says, I won't do it again, even though I'm not sorry I did it. So the resolve for the future is the most important part, and this is based on a statement of the Talmud. Talmud talks about the laws of marriage, how you could stipulate. If a person gives a woman a ring for marriage, and he says, I'm marrying you on the condition that I am a righteous person. But what happens, it turns out he's not righteous, the marriage is not valid, because he stipulated that it's based on the fact that he is righteous. Now, what happened if we discovered that 15 minutes ago, he just came from robbing a bank? Not very righteous at all. So does the marriage take effect? So you're going to all say no. And the Talmud says, yes, it takes effect. Not for sure, we're in doubt. Why does it take effect? Because maybe on the road from the bank to the wedding hall, he had a thought, I'm not going to do it again. And if he says, I'm not going to do it again, that means that he did teshuvah. So he's no longer be branded as a wicked person. Now, if he has the cash that he robbed the bank in his pocket, that would be a different story. Because that's not called a resolve to not do it again, because he's still doing it, right? Carrying the cash. So we have to assume that he returned the cash, or he brought it back to the bank and he made amends. But if the sin was another sin where you don't have to make amends by returning something, a person ate a ham sandwich on the way to the wedding hall. There's nothing you can do. You can't return the ham sandwich. But we could say, I'm not going to do it again. So the fact itself that he might have entertained that thought, that he's not going to do it again, renders him in limited ways as a tzaddik, as a righteous person. In other words, he's in good standing with God now, even though he didn't express any regret. So that's enough for a person to establish a new relationship with God from the future, from now on to the future. But we have to be honest that a person who just made a resolution but didn't express any regret or remorse, it's not likely that that resolution will last very long. We all know what happens to most of our resolutions before New Year's. They don't last very long. But especially if you don't regret what you did wrong, the chances are that you're not going to keep your resolution. But if you want to just define what is the basic aspect of Teshuvah, it's a resolution for the future. But to make the resolution sincere and enduring, you have to express regret. What does that mean to express regret? Regret means that you have to take full responsibility for what you did. If a person says, you know what, I did it, I'm sorry I did it, but you know what, I had good reasons why I did it, I have good excuses, then that's not really regret. If you don't take full responsibility and you try to find justification for what you did, someone made me do it, it's not my fault, which is something we all do all the time. When we make mistakes, we try to find some excuses. Now, when you're judging someone else, by all means, find excuses. Always look to judge other people favorably by looking for excuses. You know why the person did this sin? Probably they had a bad upbringing. Probably because they didn't realize what they were doing. You always look for ways of justifying the other. But if you want to be clean, if you want to come before God on Yom Kippur in particular, you have to take full responsibility and not try to find excuses. Because if you have good excuses, God knows them. You don't have to inform God of your excuses. He knows them and He'll judge you favorably. But you take full responsibility. Otherwise, it's not really considered proper regret. And that's why Maimonides, when he discusses the laws of Teshuvah, he incorporates the whole concept of free choice. Why does he talk about free choice in the laws of Teshuvah? Because it's fundamental to changing that you're totally honest and you don't recognize that there was anything that influenced you except your free choice. Because if you don't believe that it's your choices that did everything wrong, but it's something beyond you, someone else caused you to do it, some other circumstances, then it means that you're not really sorry, that you're not really regretting what you did. So free choice is a fundamental aspect of Teshuvah, to recognize that it's you who did it, and it's you who are changing.
Would lessen the potential depth of the return.
Right. If you give excuses for your behavior, then your Teshuvah is not complete. It doesn't mean God doesn't forgive you. As long as you resolve not to do it again, that's good enough. But it's a shallow type of Teshuvah. And the Teshuvah exists on so many different levels. The third part of Teshuvah is confession. Some people, when they say confession, they're thinking this is the Catholic religion, they have confession. No, they got it from the Torah. The Torah uses the word confession several times. When a person would bring a sacrifice to atone for a sin, the Torah says they have to confess their sin. Confession, verbal confession, not in the mind, it has to be verbal. That's why on Yom Kippur, we go through the confession of every imaginable sin about 10 times throughout the whole day. And that's, in order for the process of Teshuvah to be complete, you have to be confession. What is the reason for confession? So the Rabbi points out there that there are 3 different things about confession. Verbal confession, I emphasize the word verbal, it has to be vocalized. Number 1, sometimes you're not even aware of things that you did wrong. It's somewhere repressed in your subconscious. When you confess it, it'll expose the things that you have deep down inside of you that you would not have known about without the confession, without the verbalizing of it. Before Yom Kippur, you say all that confession. You say, 1 second, I did that. That's in fact, that's me. You didn't think of it before. Number 2, when you confess something, even something I know I did this wrong, but when you say it, it deepens the emotion. It makes it a much more much deeper emotional response to it. It's more powerful than just what you have in your thoughts. Thoughts are important. Even if you have the right thought, I did this wrong, but when you say it, it enhances the effectiveness of that expression of regret. And thirdly, sometimes in your mind, you don't feel guilty, but then when you confess it, you start feeling guilt and shame. And that itself is part of the process of Teshuvah. When a person, that's what regret is. How do you know you regret something? When you feel embarrassed that you did it. If you don't feel embarrassed, if you feel, I did it, I'm sorry I did it, I was caught, I did it, and I want to change, but if there's no shame, then it's a lackluster form of Teshuvah. So sometimes when you verbalize something, even something you don't feel strongly about inside of you, it makes you uncomfortable and it makes you feel shame. And that is part of the process of Teshuvah. But that's still not enough. To make Teshuvah complete, you have to ask for forgiveness. Now, isn't it obvious? You come to Shul on Yom Kippur, you mean to do Teshuvah, you mean to ask God for forgiveness. No, you have to actually ask for forgiveness. God knows what you need without you ever saying. He knows more of what our needs are, more than we know ourselves. But for some reason, God wants us to express our needs, because we're humans, and we can't just go by, God knows everything. We have to be aware of what it is that we want to bring before God. Why do we have to pray? If I need good health, God knows I need good health. God doesn't know I need good health and I want to have good health, so why do I have to ask God for good health? That's the way the system works. Why it works that way is a discussion for another time. But the system is that you have to ask for forgiveness. You have to be specific also. Don't just say generically, God, you know, I'm imperfect, I need forgiveness, just forgive me and let me go to my business. No, you have to spend the time focusing on individual sins that you did. You confess individual sins, and you also have to ask for forgiveness. And not only of God, but if we hurt another person, we have to ask forgiveness of the person. If a person says to God, God, I did a lot of sins, some of them against you, some of them against my fellow, I'm sorry, I did those, I won't do it again, I regret it, I'm embarrassed and everything, but it's not enough. You have to go ask that person for forgiveness. And if you don't ask for the person for forgiveness, then God doesn't forgive you fully. He can forgive you for his part of it, but he can't forgive you for the other person's part of it. Now, asking for forgiveness does more than just specifying what you want, but it also humbles you. The fact that you have to go to the other person or go before God and say, please forgive me, people are proud and they don't like to announce their shortcomings to others. But this is part of the process of Teshuvah. Now, what happens if you go to someone who you wronged and you ask for forgiveness and they say, no, I won't forgive you? So the Jewish law says that generally speaking, you have to go 3 different times. They don't have to forgive you the first or the second, but the third time they have to forgive you. The only exception to that rule is if your teacher, your mentor, your spiritual mentor realizes that you're insincere. Even though you went 3 times, you just went through a routine. You went through the motion, but you're not really sincere. He could demand that you go more than 3 times if it's part of the process of educating you. But as a general rule, if you go to someone 3 times and you ask them for forgiveness, they are obligated to forgive. And if they don't forgive, it's considered to be an un-Jewish thing. And there's this famous story in the yes?
Well, what happens if it's a horrible thing, like, you know, somebody murders their father and they go and they...
Who are they going to ask forgiveness of?
The wife.
They can't ask...
You beat somebody up and they're in the hospital for for a year, and then they say, you go over to them and you say,
Well, you have to find the right way of doing it. You can't just show up in the hospital and say, "Can you please forgive me?" It's not going to work. You have to use a little common sense. Judaism, there's 4 sections of the Code of Jewish Law, but they said a rabbi has to have the 5th section as well, which is called common sense. So if you just put someone in the hospital, don't go there and ask for forgiveness. Wait a little.
or even if you wait,
And sometimes you can't. Right.
He might not say,
Okay. If the person is sincere that they really are asking for forgiveness, and sometimes it's better to do it through an intermediary, through a third party, and they have to show they're sincere about it, and a person has to forgive. And the story is told, this is in the book of Samuel, Shmuel, the biblical text, of the descendants of the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites were a tribe that tricked the Jews into embracing them when they conquered the land of Israel. And they were relegated to being servants in the temple in Shiloh, in Nov. They were the ones who did all the work. And King Saul was running after King David, and when he found out that the people, the priests in the city of Nov were feeding King David, he got so angry he wiped out all those priests. He was paranoid, and he wiped out the priests, and these Gibeonites suffered economically because of that. And they never forgave Saul. And they demanded of King David, decades later, that he execute King Saul's descendants as revenge. And King David pleaded with them to forgive, and they refused. And at that moment, King David says, no Jew should ever marry into that tribe because they're not Jewish. Their lack of forgiveness is an indication that they're lacking basic Jewish personalities. At any rate, you have to forgive if someone comes to you sincerely and asks for forgiveness. The highest level would be, Maimonides says, is to get it out of your head. Just forgive, even if they don't ask for forgiveness. If you can do that, if you can forgive them, and they no longer are occupying space in your mind, rent-free, that's the healthiest thing. But if you're not like that, capable of doing that, you should accept their request for forgiveness. Yes?
I was just going to say, Rabbi, just what you said, but that if you are able to forgive, it makes you feel better. It frees you up.
Right. That's the ideal, to forgive even without them asking for forgiveness. But sometimes you want them to ask for forgiveness because you want them to change. You're doing it for their benefit. And that's why a teacher, a mentor, has the right to not forgive, because he's doing it for the benefit of the sinner rather than for his own honor and his own prestige. Yes?
But are there some things that you just can't get forgiveness for, like Hamas attacking Israel on October 7th?
I mean, if they ask for forgiveness and they're sincere about it, do we forgive them? The answer is we're human, and it's not going to be easy. But it's the likelihood of that happening. It's more likely that we'll all be in Mars tomorrow than that happening. So it's
genuine expressions of wanting to be forgiven means they have remorse.
But there might be an individual among them as a group. They're not going to ask for forgiveness, but it might be one individual among them who realizes how terrible his behavior was, and he might ask for forgiveness. Ultimately, we have to forgive if we're convinced of his sincerity. It's a tall order, it's very hard to do that. But there have been cases where neo-Nazis, not too many cases, changed, and they became, there's actually one story in Hungary where the leader, the second highest in a neo-Nazi group, discovered that he was Jewish. And he was the biggest anti-Semite, and he became an observant Jew eventually. It took a few years, and he went through a tremendous amount of soul searching. And so, was he able to change? Yes, he changed.
There's a story on NPR where a college student, I think at Emory, befriended a neo-Nazi who was Jewish. The person was Jewish, befriended a neo-Nazi, invited him to Shabbos dinner, came once and then repeatedly, and the guy renounced.
Yeah, that could happen in individual cases. Now, These are the few elements of Teshuvah: resolve for the future, remorse for the past, confession, and asking God for forgiveness. But there's also additional factors to Teshuvah, and that is fasting is also mentioned as a way of cleansing yourself. That's not a component of Teshuvah. That's like an aftermath of Teshuvah. You want to cleanse yourself completely. It's used as the example used is if you hurt someone's feelings, you hurt someone and you ask for forgiveness and the person says, I forgive you, but your relationship with that person won't be the same thing. So what do? To restore the relationship? You send them a gift. So that was the idea of bringing a sacrifice as an atonement. The sacrifice doesn't atone itself. The sacrifice is like the gift that you bring after you already made amends. But you want to restore the relationship, so you send them a gift. We don't have sacrifices, so fasting is like a sacrifice, because you're giving up some of your own body's meat and flesh and blood. But what happens if fasting is not a viable way of doing things because it's not good for your health? So tzedakah, and even if you do fast, it's still good to give charity. Tzedakah has the same effect as fasting or bringing a sacrifice. That's what we do to restore the relationship to the way it was before. Now, the Talmud talks about two levels of teshuvah. It talks about teshuvah motivated by fear and teshuvah motivated by love. What is the difference? Fear means I'm afraid of consequences. I'm afraid that if I don't do teshuvah, God will punish me, or society will punish me, and I don't want the effects of my sins to remain. So you do teshuvah out of fear. So the Talmud says what that does is it mitigates, it reduces the severity of your sin from an intentional to unintentional. It doesn't wipe out your sin completely. It's like an unintentional sin. What's an unintentional sin? When you do a sin unintentionally, unless it was a total accident, it means that you were not conscientious. You were not thinking, and you tended to do something wrong out of neglect. So that still is a little bit of a tinge of that sin. It still exists. So the sin is not completely obliterated. But then there's teshuvah out of love. Teshuvah out of love means that you recognize that how far you distance yourself from God. And a person, by nature, if the nature of your godly soul is active, that's the worst thing that could possibly happen to you, that you're distanced from God, that you remove your closeness to God. And then that creates in you a thirst, a surge of passion. I want to get close to God because I've been so far away. When you're close to God, you don't feel that passion because you're already accustomed to that. But when you're far and you recognize how far you are, it develops a tremendous passion to get closer. So that means that your teshuvah was done out of love. When that happens, the Talmud says, not only are your sins forgiven, wiped away, they're transformed into mitzvahs. Every sin that you did that motivated you to do teshuvah out of love becomes an asset, a merit, a mitzvah. The story is told that in the city of Berditchev, where the famous Rabbi Levi Yitzchak was the rabbi, and he was known legendary, looking for the good in everything and everyone. So the sinner he summons the sinner to him on the day before Yom Kippur, and he says, "I'm envious of you." And the sinner says, "You're making fun. You're mocking me. I've done every sin in the book. You're envious of me? I'm a lowlife." He says, "Yes, I'm envious of you, because if you do teshuvah, your sins will all be transformed into mitzvahs. I can never do as many mitzvahs as you've done sins in your life. And so I'm envious of you." And he meant it. He wasn't saying this to mock this person. He was trying to get this person to realize that, on the contrary, because he had sinned so much, he could reach the highest levels. And as the Talmud concludes, that there's a dispute about this, but the conclusion is that the place where a Baal Teshuvah, a person who returns to God, stands, even the most righteous person cannot stand in that place. So the person who sins has such an opportunity that nobody else has if the person did not sin. And that itself is a great motivating factor, to know that, yes, I messed my life up until now, but I could change. And not only could I change, but my change will make me more worthy than people who were righteous their whole life. We'll continue this next week, God willing.